Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We really appreciate your time. My name is Katie Earle, and I'm the coordinator of the University Express program, and I work for the Erie County Department of Senior Services. And we're joined here virtually today with Rosanne Higgins, and really grateful for her being here with us. And we do have some new folks on today, so I'm just going to go over some quick housekeeping things. First thing is, you just heard me say we are recording this session, and I will try to post it on our website at a later date. Second thing, which I'm sure you've already noticed, is that you have joined muted and without your video showing, and those are just the settings for our program. You've done nothing wrong, so you don't have to worry about that. And you also might think you're the only person here in attendance with us today, but as you've heard, we have other people in here, just that we're in an anonymous participation mode, so only Rosanne and I are the only ones who can see everybody who's in here. So throughout Rosanne's presentation, if you have any questions or comments, please put those in the Q&A panel right away, and we'll try to get to those as we go through her presentation and then try to cover as many things as we can at the end. So again, if you're new to us and if you joined from a computer or laptop, chances are that Q&A panel popped right up on the right-hand side of your screen. It might be there now. You just have to hit that little caret to expand it, and then you'll see your text box, and you can send your questions to Rosanne or myself. If you don't see that on the right-hand side of your WebEx screen, if you look to the lower right-hand corner, you might see a half circle with a square with a question mark in it in Q&A. You can click on that to expand it. And last but not least, if you're on a tablet or smartphone, poke or touch your screen. That will bring up your control panel. You'll see 3 dots. Click on that, and there you'll find your Q&A panel. So we hope you participate and have some fun with us here today. I'd like to thank the sponsors of our program, my Department of Senior Services, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans for everything they helped do to make this program possible. And as always, please do not hesitate to contact us at Senior Services. If you have questions about programs, services, benefits for yourself or a loved one, we are happy to help however we can. Please take advantage of us. We're at 858-8526. All right. Dr. Rosen Higgins is an anthropologist, a lecturer, and a writer. She received a master's degree and a doctoral degree in anthropology from the University of Buffalo. Her primary areas of study were in skeletal biology and historical demography. These 2 fields of inquiry have been employed to study the disenfranchised in the United States during the 19th century. She was an assistant professor in the anthropology department at SUNY Potsdam and an assistant professor in the health sciences department at Cleveland State University. She has been a small business owner since 2003 and an adjunct professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Buffalo since 2013. Rosanne, I'm going to unmute you, mute myself, and turn it over. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you everybody for tuning in. I would say it's lovely to see you, but I can't see you, so I hope that you will bear with me because I've not done a live stream lecture before, and so if it's a little awkward or I stumble a little bit, my apologies. So I am also a writer of historical fiction. The Orphans and Inmates series is a series that takes place in Buffalo in the 19th century and is now going into with this book and the last book, the 20th century. And the story talks initially about 3 sisters who came from Ireland to Buffalo in 1835. And their story plays out again across the 19th century against the backdrop of Buffalo's very, very interesting history. The story always bounces between the modern era and the past. And in the present, the character Maud Travers is an anthropologist and a psychic medium who often finds herself being presented with these, for lack of a better word, supernatural sorts of quests. And so in the beginning of the series, Maud as a character becomes aware that she is gifted with the skills of a psychic medium. And so in the first few books, she's in disbelief and then very scared. And really just in the last book has come to grips with her skills and has honed them and is confident with them. And so that's where our story brings us, is to Maud's understanding that she now has the power to ask questions rather than having information just presented to her in a vision or a dream. So you might recognize this tree if you live in North Buffalo. It is a white oak tree in Delaware Park. It's easily seen if you're walking along the ring, along that track in the park, heading uphill on the side of the Scourge Expressway. It is arguably the oldest tree in the city. And I say arguably, I'll get to that. Why? Because there is another tree that has been designated the oldest tree in the city. But this tree caught my attention for lots of reasons. As I said, I'm a resident, or maybe I didn't say, I'm a resident of North Buffalo. I have been most of my adult life. And so the park is, you know, a regular place in my life that I go to all the time. And a friend of mine who is an archaeologist did this circumference dating method on this tree, which means that he measured the circumference of the tree and he applied this statistical formula, and he determined that this tree is probably about 10 years older than the sycamore on Franklin Street, which is technically the oldest tree in the city, excuse me. It's thought that the sycamore on Franklin germinated about 1710, making it about 310 years old now. My friend Dan Kadzow, who measured this tree, both trees, determined that the white oak in Delaware Park is about 320 years old. So it's got the sycamore by about 10 years. So you could argue that the circumference dating method is not accurate. It could, you know, there's lots of room for error, and you would of course be right. The real way to find out a tree's actual age is to chop it down and count the rings, but that of course would ruin this magnificent tree. And so whether or not you want to believe that it's the oldest tree or not, it's certainly a very old tree. It predates, you know, the incorporation of the city of Buffalo. It stands in what was Seneca land and is now the you know, Delaware Park, which, you know, for arguably in the 19th century was a social center of North Buffalo and of the city itself. So I got to thinking, you know, what is this tree seen? What could it tell us if it could talk? And then I remembered Maud happens to be a psychic medium and is able to make contact with objects, and she receives visions about their history, important things that she's meant to learn. So that's kind of how the story was born. Just wondering what this great tree has seen in its 320 years. So this tree stands in what's called the meadow. That's the one part of Delaware Park, and it is referred to as an oak opening. And an oak opening is an area that results from what was Iroquois horticultural land. So historically, predating Buffalo, this was Iroquois land. And when the Iroquois cleared the land for farming, they kept the oak trees. And the reason they kept the oak trees was because acorns could be a source of food for people. If you leach out the tannins and you grind up the acorns, they make a flour that has a large shelf life and is useful as a food supplement. But also, acorns are a food source for turkeys and squirrels and deer and such, and so provide another source of food for the people. So the oak trees tended to not be cleared when they cleared the land for horticulture. So that's, I think, probably why it's still standing here 320 years later. The Seneca were the largest of the 6 nations that made up the Iroquois Confederacy, which also included the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Tuscarora people. They were known as the keepers of the Western Door because they occupied the westernmost region of the Iroquois territory, which encompasses now the city of Buffalo. So up until 1779, most of the Seneca villages were clustered around the Jennison River Valley. And they extended, people lived in extended family units in longhouses, much like you see depicted here. And they relied on horticulture, as I mentioned, and hunting as their main way to make a living. However, in that year, 1779, Washington launched an attack called the Scorched Earth Campaign against all of the Native American people who were in support of the British. And that was quite brutal attack. Among its victims were the Seneca people. General Sullivan's army kind of traveled from northeast Pennsylvania along the Susquehanna River, crossing the Finger Lakes region on their way to the Genesee River, burning crop fields and destroying orchards and displacing thousands of people who fled to the Niagara frontier. And this was a brutal act. It was an act of war. It was designed to exterminate the people who were supporting the British Army. Upwards of 4,000 people, native people, were left homeless and fled to the Fort Niagara, for shelter over that winter. After that, many Seneca built settlements in the area that they called the forking of the two rivers, which referred to the area where Buffalo and Cazenovia Creeks meet. And the Buffalo Creek settlement, which features into my story, was in 1780 and 1842. It served as the political and ceremonial center for the Six Nations, and it was a place where important business was conducted. I want to show you this picture, which is the earliest known picture of Buffalo. And it's circa 1811, so it's a little bit later than the period that I'm talking about. My book sort of focuses on the period right after the Revolutionary War. And so this is just to show you how raw and wild this area was, that it wasn't a settled city. And so Maud Travers wanted to know, as I told you, what the tree could tell her. And so she lays hands on the tree, and she sees three visions in rapid succession. Indicates a time period around this time, around the end of the Revolutionary War. And the second period encompasses the time around the end of the 19th century, around 1890, and the third just after the turn of the century, in the early years of the 20th century. And so the story takes place with her sort of trying to utilize her gifts as a psychic medium and her gifts as a researcher, as an anthropologist, to try to understand what these visions are, what they mean, if they're linked, and all of that. And so she learns about this period just after the Revolutionary War. And so I think it's worth looking at this area taken from Buffalo Creek, at this period where before Buffalo was a city, when it was literally a handful of settlers and largely still occupied by the Seneca people. The story of Mary Jemison inspired a character in my book named Sheila Harrington. Mary Jemison was an Irish girl, because of course it's always about the Irish in Buffalo in my books. She was a girl who lived with her family originally in Pennsylvania. And in 1758, when she was just a girl, her family farm was raided by a group of Shawnee and some Frenchmen, and her family was taken captive. And it was a brutal experience that she wrote about later in her life. And it was terrifying. She talks about how, her father was just so sort of terrified by the experience that he shut down. And it was really her mother who sort of remained calm and for the time that the family was together, sort of tried to get everybody through this very terrifying experience. And she talks about how one of the Native American people walked behind the children with a whip and was whipping them to get them to keep up, because the kids couldn't keep up as the band, moved away from the family farm. And she talks about how they didn't stop to rest, they didn't stop to eat. If they were thirsty, the option was to drink their own urine, which is horrifying. And then eventually she is separated from her family and she's traded to the Seneca. Eventually, the Seneca adopted her. I mean, they did right away from the time that she was traded, and she lived in a village on the Genesee River initially, and she ultimately married within the tribe she lived in and had children. And she was married, by the time that Sullivan was raiding all the Seneca land during the Scorched Earth campaign. So she lived as a Seneca during those perilous years after the war when, the new American government was trying to negotiate treaties for the acquisition of land. And so her story intrigued me for a lot of reasons. She's an Irish girl, so of course, as I said, if you know the books, you know that the Irish experience in Buffalo is something that I write often about. My mother would slap me for saying this because she says we're Scots, but we're Irish too. So that's always been an interest of mine. And so the fact that she was alive at this time, that she endured that rebuilding of the life after the Scorched Earth campaign, and that she lived, she had been, in the early years of her life, raised as an Irish girl, and then for the rest of her life as a Seneca woman. So her story fascinated me, and I wanted to incorporate it into this story. And so I feel like I need to give you sort of a little bit of a disclaimer. Just the researcher in me, I guess, has to say this out loud. When I wrote previously, it was mostly about the institutional history of Buffalo, the Erie County Poorhouse and Insane Asylum. And for me, that was a life's work. It was something I devoted my entire life to studying, and I knew a lot about and could answer questions about in my sleep. And as I'm writing these books that take place later in time, that step outside of that institution and examine other areas of Buffalo's history, especially this book that goes way back to the beginning, there's always for me, a conflict, because once I start researching something, I tend to sort of fall down that rabbit hole and could easily set everything aside and continue asking questions until I'm satisfied I know everything I want to know. And the reality and practicality of that is that it's not possible to do that in the current life I'm in. I don't write for a living. I have a day job, and I have to do research with the intent of adding historical authenticity to the fictional story, and not writing a nonfiction work where I gain expertise on this subject or any subject. So I always feel like I need to say that out loud as we sort of talk about these things that influence this particular story, because these are areas that I'm not an expert in. I would have loved to have explored Mary Jemison's story and its implications to real history in a lot more detail than I did. One of the things that I did was that I sort of intersected her story, the character of Sheila Harrington, who's based on Mary Jemison. I intersected that story with the story of Thomas Proctor, who was also of Irish descent. Funny, to me it's interesting that these people just sort of crossed my path. He was appointed by the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, after the Revolutionary War, to meet with the leaders of the Six Nations and enlist their help brokering peace with the Native American people along Lake Erie in what they call the Ohio country. And it was a really interesting choice to choose him, because he was part of Sullivan's army and he was part of the Scorched Earth campaign. So he had taken part in the brutal destruction and uprooting of the lives of the Seneca people, but then, went to go ask for their help. So to me, that was just a very strange choice, and something, again, that I would have loved to have poured a lot more time into researching than I was really able to. So he set out in 1791 to travel to Buffalo Creek, which, as I said, was the ceremonial center of the Six Nations at the time, and the place where important business was conducted. He set out to travel to Buffalo Creek to ask for this help. And so he was received along the way by other Native people who took him in and offered him their hospitality graciously, as is the custom and culture of most Native people, even though he was who he was, even though he was a man who partook in a very brutal act of war, even though he was rather arrogant and made no attempt to understand the language, was not gracious in acknowledging the hospitality he was given. And so his story really piqued my interest. And for me, one of the fun parts of writing fiction is to kind of go, well, what about if it was this way? What if he wasn't such an arrogant man? What if he had, how might things have worked out differently had he not been who he was? And so what's interesting for me, and I think maybe, I mean, it's interesting from a storytelling point of view. If you're looking for an accurate historical account, don't read this. But I do bend the stories of both Mary Jemison and Thomas Proctor into this sort of what if tale. What if this guy wasn't such a bad guy? What if Mary Jemison had a more active role in that negotiation after the war, and how might that have changed things? And so Maud, getting back to the story, Maud learns all of this as she's unraveling that first vision. And so I'm losing my train of thought here, but she needs that information to move on. She needs to have learned about how that plays out in the story to try to understand the next sort of vision that she saw. So this is a picture of Buffalo this is from 1881, and it's maybe a few years before when my story now takes place, because the vision, as I said, jumps from sort of right after the Revolutionary War to like the early 1890s. So this is a bit early, but still you get a sense that Buffalo has gone from this in that, 100 years to this. It's not a trading post occupied by a handful of people anymore. It's an incorporated city of over 200,000 people. And that's the backdrop against which the second part of the story takes place, where Maud is unraveling this vision she sees that clearly is happening in this time period. And so what we learn in the story is that Kira Nolan, who you might remember if you read the books from The Orphans and Inmates, from the original book and some of the subsequent novels, she is back in this story, and she is hosting her grandson, who is attending the medical college at the University of Buffalo, which is depicted here. The medical college was established in 1846. So by my story, by the time we're into the 1890s, it's been around for quite a while. It's moved. So this is the building that would have been where my story took place. Second location was at Main and Virginia Streets until I think 1893 or 4. So into the period where my story is taking place, it would have taken place here. Some of these other pictures are from, I did some research at the History of Medicine Library at UB. And so some of these are artifacts from medical school back in the day. So just to give you a sense of the history of the institution. The first female student was accepted in 1874. So by the time my story is unraveling in the 1890s, it's not unusual for there to be women students. It's not commonplace. It's not socially acceptable in many circles, but there were students, women, at the University of Buffalo at the time. So the inclusion of the medical school in this story is sort of represents my fascination with the evolution of modern medicine, and particularly how it plays out in Buffalo. So as Katie told you, I am an anthropologist by training, and we utilize this sort of lens through which we view everything, and it's called a biocultural lens. And what that means is we pretty much look at everything in terms of how biology impacts culture and how culture impacts biology, and looking back into the past and into the future, and even now in the present, there are just untold examples of that, the pandemic right now being one of them. So anyway, this sort of part of that, the evolution of modern medicine in an era where infectious disease was so prevalent. The 19th century was riddled with all sorts of infectious diseases that I'll talk about actually in a little while. And so modern medicine is getting its legs underneath it right at this time. But also what's happening at this time, and if you're a fan of the books, then you understand that modern spiritualism, the religion of modern spiritualism, is also really firming up its identity in the 1880s and 90s. And so we have the modern spiritualist community of Lisdale, an hour south of us, which was an important spot in the formation of the identity of modern spiritualists. And so that puts Buffalo as one of the most important places in the world as this religion is trying to figure itself out. And so getting back to sort of the advent of modern medicine that's happening as we see the idea of clairvoyant healing being experimented with among the modern spiritualists. And that's the idea that you can channel a spirit guide who can guide you into healing people. And so, again, you know, if you're a fan of the books, you know that Alba Abalt is a character who was, she was inspired by Antoinette Matheson, who was an actual clairvoyant healer who lived in Buffalo and had a house in Lilydale. And she made a fortune as a healer. She was, among the people she healed, considered to be a legitimate physician. She had a thriving practice in Buffalo, but she was at odds with the medical community. That way of healing was at odds with the medical community. And she was often arrested for practicing medicine without a license. She was considered a nuisance among the doctors in Buffalo. And so that story carries itself into this story, in the shadow of the white oak, because there's still that dynamic of the spiritualists, which attracted women largely because women were given an equal voice among the spiritualists, where they weren't given an equal voice anywhere else in the culture of Buffalo or in the country at the time. And, you know, women still had their power as healers among the modern spiritualists, where that power was being taken away from them by men. As the era of modern medicine gets underway, it's primarily the domain of men. As I said, there were a few women doctors, not many, and largely they would practice in the insane asylums. So this dynamic that has played out in other books of mine plays out in this book as well, and is it's important for Maud to understand that this is persisting as she's trying to understand this second vision that she sees, that takes place, partly in the medical school and partly in Buffalo in the 1890s, and includes that conflict between men and women, between healing and medicine. And again, she needs that information to move on to the third vision that she's trying to unravel. So by the turn of the 19th century, again, we see the city of Buffalo explode population-wise. We're up to like 350,000 people by the turn of the century. So just rapid population growth. So again, we've gone from that to that to that in such a short time, in a century, essentially. And that, again, the anthropologist in me is blown away by that transformation. And of course, in that transformation, you have the Industrial Revolution, which is taking place all over the world and in Buffalo at that time, where we've moved away from the primary economy of farming, and we've moved into the cities, and we have all of the problems that large overpopulated cities have. We have a huge problem with poverty. We have a huge problem with overcrowding and the sanitation issues that go along with that. And so the 19th century, as I mentioned before, is literally, characterized by one wave after another of infectious diseases. And my research as a scholar and as an anthropologist has focused on that, because again, it's a way that biology influences culture and culture influences biology. We see that the biological end of it, the causing of these diseases, takes a great toll on the population. Mortality rates are incredibly high during the 19th century. The infant mortality rates, like 50%. Half of all the babies, born in the mid part of the century don't make it, to a year old. We see the age of death for women in the 19th century at about 35, largely because of the dangers of childbirth and just the stress of reproduction and the strain it takes on a body. And the life expectancy of men is not much better. It's about 45. And again, it's the dangers of the industrial economy. And so this is all following us into those early years of the 20th century. And so we see, again, the biology influencing the culture. We see public health measures are undertaken to try to, understand this. And this is, and stop all of the spread of infectious diseases. And this is, prior to the era of antibiotics. We don't see antibiotics until the 1940s. And so it's largely public health measures, cleaning up sanitation, better disposal of garbage, better, cleaning up of the water supply, better diet, things like that. of these infectious diseases under control, especially things like cholera. Is by the end of the century, we know how to manage and avoid that. But the respiratory illnesses, especially tuberculosis and pneumonia, continue to plague the human populations until the advent of antibiotics. And so this was a really interesting. This always interests me, but now it was fascinating to me because up until now I had written about these deadly pandemics without any understanding of really what it was like to live through one. But the bulk of this book was written during the pandemic, our COVID-19 pandemic. And so it offered me a whole new way of understanding how people react in these things. And honestly, if I had it to do over again, I'd write the Year of the Scholar all over again, because that has to do with the cholera epidemics. Things are a little different now. This is a pandemic in the era of mass media. It's a pandemic where technology has allowed us literally to travel from one part of the world to the other in a day. So it's a slightly different world, but people are people, and we all respond to fear and uncertainty similarly. And so this whole book has been interesting. It's been interesting to write this at this time. But anyway, getting back to my specific infectious disease, respiratory illnesses as we get into the 20th century are still a problem, tuberculosis particularly. And tuberculosis was a major threat, especially to urban populations, because it was a respiratory illness, because it thrives in overcrowded, poorly ventilated areas, which characterized most of the city at the time. It disproportionately affected poor people, much as COVID-19 disproportionately affects poor people as well. Not because of mostly because the opportunity is there. Poor people don't have the option to leave the city the way rich people did. One of the things that wealthy people tended to do in the summer, particularly during the crises of things like cholera, is they'd leave the city to get away from the danger. It was safer in the rural areas. And the same thing with tuberculosis in the wintertime, when it was people were cooped up indoors, and again in these poorly ventilated, sometimes overcrowded areas. Wealthier people had the option not to be there. Poor people didn't. Poor people had to go to work, regardless of whether they weren't feeling well, much the same way that they do now. So there was a stigma with tuberculosis as being this disease of the lower classes that affected the lower classes because they were lower class, not for the real reasons that they just in harm's way more. If you put, same thing with COVID-19, you put a whole bunch of different people in a room of various socioeconomic, statuses, and TB is it's not gonna discriminate. It doesn't care how much money you make. But there was this stigma nevertheless. And so when it did affect wealthy people, it was something they were inclined not to talk about publicly. When wealthier people died of tuberculosis, it was not something people talked about. It was not something that families wanted known, that was the reason. And so tuberculosis is also something that you can have for years, oftentimes a decade, before it can really do its damage and kill you. So this was something, as I said, the upper class people tried to keep a secret. And so without giving away how that plays into my story, it does play significantly into my story. The idea that this disease is perceived differently by wealthy people, that they are inclined to want to keep it a secret, is a part of the story without, as I said, getting into too many details. You'll have to read the book. So at the heart of the story is the land that would become Delaware Park. As the story bounces back and forth through history, it returns often to this place. Throughout the centuries and into the modern era, it's always a part of the story. And it's for me, it's because the land has seen so much, not just the area around the tree. And so my next couple of slides are really more fun. I have a collection of vintage postcards of Delaware Park. If you look at the one up it's my left-hand corner, probably should be yours too, was from 1907, which is around the time that third vision is taking place. And so I had quite a good time to myself looking through these postcards and looking to see if I had pictures that sort of closely resembled the postcard. And so that was kind of the fun that I had putting together this presentation. So the picture underneath it is taken from the railing of what would have been the boathouse at the time, and which is now the Terrace restaurant. You could see, not quite in the same place, but the Albright Knox Art Gallery. And you know what, Katie, you are, I don't know if we can move you, because the picture on the right, actually where you are on my screen, is covering up the boathouse. And so I don't know if I can move. Can I try to move you? Or no?
You can move me because
yeah,
I'm
look at that.
wait for you.
All right, can you see it now? Because I moved you. Awesome. All right, so just a little bit of history about Delaware Park. The park was designed by Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, the same people who designed Central Park in New York. I don't know if many people know, but they also designed the grounds of the Buffalo State Asylum. Those grounds were intended to be intentionally beautiful as part of the therapy of patients that were at the hospital. And so that was another project by Frederick Law Olmsted. Having Delaware Park was a major feather in the cap of Buffalo, and it was certainly a sign that we had arrived as a city, as an important city on the world stage. And so the park began construction in 1870 on the side of what we call the water park. So if you know anything about the history of the park, there were two concepts of the park, two different sides that were separated initially by a parkway, but are now separated by the Scourge Expressway. The water park side, which you're seeing here, was a recreational park. It had the lake, which was originally called Gallo Water. It's now called Hoyt Lake. It was enjoyed primarily by the rich in the early years of the park, although the park was designed to be used by everybody. In the early years of its existence toward the end of the 19th century, there really wasn't still adequate mass transportation. So the neighborhoods surrounding the park were occupied by very wealthy people. And so it really was a playground for the rich in those early years. The original boathouse, which was built in 1875, was a wooden structure. It was enlarged in 1883, but it burned down just at the turn of the century in 1899. The structure you see on the right-hand side, the brick and limestone building, was constructed in 1900, just in time for the Pan American Exhibition, which was, again, another one of those world events that really placed Buffalo as an important city, one of the most important cities in the world. I feel like I'm a broken record and I say this all the time, but I often wonder if the residents of this city understand just how important Buffalo was. If we go back to this picture, of the industrial waterfront, this is part of what made Buffalo this enormously successful city. It had the river and the two lakes and the railroad. It had a very large supply of skilled laborers. It had cheap hydroelectric power, by virtue of Niagara Falls. And it had an ever-growing population of consumers. So it really was a place that businessmen focused on to either increase their fortunes or make their fortunes. And so when we look at places like Delaware Park and the Buffalo State Asylum and the Albright Knox Gallery and the Pan American Exhibition, those were all, again, signs that we were such an important city, not only in the country, but on the world stage. And the opportunities here attracted great men who did great things. And so that is also part of what Maud understands in that final vision. She meets, we have new characters that she meets through her historic ability to connect with the past, who were steel magnates from Pittsburgh who come to Buffalo to make their fortune. And that plays out in the rest of the story. And throughout the story, as I said, is always Delaware Park. I'm going to move you again because you're blocking the ivy arch, which is the oldest current structure in the park. It was built in 1890 and it's still there. You can see it was quite in the early years of the 20th century, quite grown with all kinds of ivy and other greenery. And if you look at my picture, it's been trimmed back quite a bit in the modern era, but it's still there. And if you read the books, it provides a great secret rendezvous sort of location because it's in a little tucked away in Rumsey Woods at the back of the park. The Rose Garden, which was completed in 1917, is again one of the more beautiful places of the park. I don't think my picture does it justice. I think the postcard's a little bit better, but again, it's a place where people went to stroll and to meet and to experience the beauty of the park. And you'll see it mentioned and it shows up in various parts of the book just because it's one of those landmarks that's endured till today. There's still a group of people who maintain the gardens and they're absolutely spectacular. And the nice thing about the park is, in this horrible pandemic where we're all sort of stuck inside, the park is a place we can go. It's safe. We can go and we can put our masks on if anybody walks by, but we can also take our masks off and enjoy the beauty of the park and a little bit of fresh air while the weather still holds. Not today though, because it's very lousy today. A lot of the story takes place in the meadow, on the other side of the park. And the meadow was designed, Frederick Law Olmsted envisioned this to resemble like pastoral England. And so when you look at the black and white picture on the right-hand side, there were sheep grazing on the inside of the ring. And there were sheep and deer that were purchased with the intent of enhancing that pastoral look. And what always sort of gives me a chuckle too is that they purchased squirrels for the park. Like they actually, and sparrows to sort of keep the insect population down, but squirrels. So I laugh every time I'm walking my dog in the park and because they take off after a squirrel. Chances are that squirrel is the ancestor was brought there on purpose. So that is always interesting to me how much of the park was, what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, when you look at the number of people that were here, the per capita millionaires, there was a huge tax base in Buffalo at that time. And it's reflected in how the parks were kept up, that they could maintain a flock of sheep in the park and deer and elk, and that the zoo basically sort of evolved around that. That these big families would make these donations to the park of elk and of deer, and then the more exotic of elephants and orangutans. And throughout the late 1890s and into the early decades of the 20th century, you see all these records of the Parks Department of people making these donations of animals that eventually become the Buffalo Zoo. But you also, when you read the Parks Department reports, I mean, the park had its own police force. The park had a caretaker actually lived. If you look at the, wrong way. If you look at, I'm going to move you again. If you look at the boathouse, okay, there's a third story on the boathouse, and that was the caretaker's cottage. So somebody actually got to live in Delaware Park and care for it. And so the city has always taken good care of these wonderful landmarks that we have. And it represents, again, a time when there's a lot of money and that Buffalo was very concerned with how it looked to outsiders. And I think we've lost that over the years. We've certainly lost the tax base over the years. And the park is still a wonderful place to be, but it's not that grand place that it used to be, that place where you could stroll on horseback through all of these trails, and there was not a twig out of place because the bridle paths were meticulously kept, which they outline in detail in the Parks Department reports, just how much maintenance went into keeping that park this posh playground for the rich in those years. So it's a fascinating place to tell stories, especially from the perspective of this tree who's seen it all. This tree saw the Seneca people who worked the land before it became this elaborate, playground for the rich. And now that tree sees the soccer games that happen and the golf balls that get hit its way, because it's a golf course now, instead of a meadow that hosts all kinds of farm animals. So it's seen a lot, and the story reflects that. And I hope that people will find that interesting. So the books, I'm going to move you over here one more time. If you're interested in the series, Orphans and Inmates is the first of the book, and then A Whisper of Bones, The Seer and the Scholar, A Lifetime Again, The Girl on the Shore, A Mind's Eye Witness, and then In the Shadow of the White Oak, which is the new one. It's coming out December 4th and 5th, actually. Fingers crossed that we can do an actual live book signing, social distance book signing with masks and all of that. I'm less optimistic of that now than I was when we first decided to promote that. The book is available for pre-order at the Antique Lamp Company. That website is on the slide. If we are able to have a live book signing where people can actually come, people can pick up the book and I'll sign it. If we are not able to have a live thing, then I will also sign it and we will mail it to you. So if you're interested in the new book or you're interested in any of the others, they are available at the Antique Lamp Company. The other titles are available on Amazon as well, but the Shadow of the White Oak, which is the new one, is only available for December 4th and 5th at the Antique Lamp Company and will become available after that in other sources. So I have, I don't know, not much more to say, but I'm happy to entertain questions if you've got them. No questions? I don't have your little menu, so I don't know if there are any.
That's okay. I'm seeing a couple.
Okay.
If you want to pull yours up, just bring your mouse all the way up.
Okay, I'm going all the way up, and then, okay, and then what do? I do Q&A.
Yep. So
okay,
sure
now
I see any.
I am not. I'm not sure what all I'm seeing is a box. I'm not. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. I don't understand how I get to. Oh, Pat. Hi, Pat. What's this? So many historical insights interwoven into the characters and the storyline, very intriguing. This is from Linda. Thank you, Linda. Wait, Katie, can you read these? I'm going too. I can't seem to stop them in time to read them. Are you able to read the questions?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
All right, so yes, we have from Linda, so many historical insights interwoven into the characters and storylines, very intriguing. Where do we buy your books, which is just what we went over, and kudos.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Next thing I'm seeing is, how did you learn about Mary Jemison?
Mary Jemison, I mean, she's a historical figure, and I stumbled upon her. I'm trying to think of how I was doing some research just in general about the Seneca presence on the Niagara frontier, and her story came up in that sort of initial search. And the fact that she was Irish really piqued my interest, and I did some research about her at the Buffalo Irish Genealogical Society. And they were very helpful, and it was such a fun experience. So if we're ever allowed to go out into the world again and you're interested in your Irish ancestors, I highly recommend that you visit them. And I'm sure that there is some way to contact them online, and now I'm thinking I probably should have offered that and I don't have it. But anyway, so I found her, and the fact that she was Irish, and again, the idea that she was around during this really critical time and that she had experienced this very unique life of having, started her childhood as a settler, and by her own account, she had a pretty happy childhood. And which is interesting because, life for children on the frontier was not easy. It was incredibly difficult. I mean, when you look at that picture of Buffalo, that wild picture of Buffalo, the area that she would have, lived in Pennsylvania wouldn't have been much different. So it really was building a life from the ground up. And in those days, even small children had a role to play, had a job. I mean, unless you were a wee baby, even little 4-year-old kids had something to do. They could haul pails of water or, whatever. I mean, children all worked. So by her own account, her life was very happy until that day. And then it's a quite vivid account of when they were captured. And I would have been terrified as an adult. I can't even imagine being a kid. You know, she was, I think, in her maybe early teens, 12, 13, something like that. And then again, went on to live her entire life with Seneca. She had the opportunity to leave as an adult and didn't. So I think that, you know, says that she was happy in that life. So her story was fascinating to me. And I again, if there ever is a point in my life I don't have to work for a living, that's on my list of things I'd love to learn more about.
Thanks, Roseanne. Next question, about how much time do you spend on researching for your book?
Well, each book takes about a year to write. And this one was delayed mostly by the pandemic, but it did give me, because it was a little longer than a year, but it gave me a little extra time to do some work. And I mean, honestly, it probably would have taken that long anyway, even if it hadn't been for the pandemic, because as I mentioned before, you know, the first 4 or 5 books were all about, the first 4 books, were all really about the institutional history of Buffalo. They were all in some way attached to the Erie County Poorhouse, which is my life's work. So there was a lot that I already knew and less that I had to research from the ground up. As I'm getting into these other books, like for example, The Girl on the Shore, I actually went to Ireland. I went to the Aran Islands. That book sort of talks about how this family left Ireland to begin with and come to Buffalo. And so I went to Ireland to do some field research about that. And then, you know, the book, A Mind's Eye Witness, took place in the 1920s. I knew absolutely nothing about Buffalo in the 1920s. This book really has quite a bit of the, you know, colonial period, the period right around the war, Revolutionary War. I really didn't know anything about that. And so it takes a lot of time, but for me, it's excruciating because I always want to know more. And as a scholar, I was taught that, you know, you learn everything you need to know about a topic. That's how you do research. And as a writer of fiction, the luxury of doing that simply doesn't exist. You have to sort of research what you need to tell your story and move on. And it's very hard to do that because so much of this is so interesting. I really wanted to get into like the whole story of Thomas Proctor and his experience in Buffalo Creek leading up to then the Treaty of Big Tree, which was the big land transfer from the Seneca to the United States. All of that was fascinating to me, and I really had to make myself stop. Like, I can't look into this. And so I'm by no means an expert on any of this, but there's always more that I want to know, and it's always that balance between making sure that I understand I'm writing fiction and it's a book and it's not meant to change anybody's life. It's not meant to argue a point or not argue a point. It's just fiction. So I think I'm entertaining like the Black Musicians Club, the Color Musicians Club is something that's intrigued me maybe for the next book. Again, that's something I know nothing about, the history of people of color in Buffalo. And so that is probably going to take a lot of research again to understand, at least to be able to talk about intelligently and figure out where the bends in the story occur. And so there's always a lot of research, which is what I like to do, but never as much as I want.
Thank you, Roseanne. Next thing. Never heard of all of those animals in the park and the start of the zoo.
Oh yeah, the start of the zoo was really interesting because initially the animals that they purchased for the park were species that, you know, were easily able to withstand a buffalo winter. There were caretakers; they obviously weren't left to their own devices, but you know there were stables that were attached to the park property at the time, and there was somebody to care for those animals. But as more exotic species were being donated, and obviously animals that were not able to withstand a buffalo winter, like the great apes and alligators, or tons of alligators that were donated to the zoo over the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. All these animals that were exotic and not able to really withstand our winters, that's when they had to start thinking about building different quarters for these animals. And you know, we have the designation of being one of the oldest zoos in the country, and that's reflected in some of the less humane ways animals were housed in the early years. And in the 1920s, there was a big outcry publicly. It played out in the newspapers because there hadn't been any updates to the zoo. You know, they figured out in the 1890s that they had to do something because they were getting all these animals. But then they really didn't update any of the living quarters for these animals, and there was a big public outcry, and that's when this private sort of group formed the Buffalo Zoological Society, and the zoo separated itself from the Parks Department.
Oh, thanks, Rosanne. Next thing, great program, Rosanne. Enjoyed your books. What do you see for the future of Buffalo?
What do I see for the future of Buffalo? Gosh, I don't know. I would like to see the future in which I can go out of my house without a mask. I think we're all, I think Buffalo was undergoing a resurgence prior to the pandemic. You know, there are areas of the city that were, kind of falling into disrepair that have been, that are seeing new life. And my hope is that trend continues. I mean, I was a suburban girl. I was raised in Williamsville, but I've spent all of my adult life in the city. I raised my kids in the city, and I wouldn't leave the city. I love the city of Buffalo. And it's so funny, when I was growing up in Williamsville, it was like this other place, it might as well have been another planet, the city. To me, that's a lot of people in the suburbs still see it that way. I have to go all the way into the city, you hear that kind of thing. And it really is worth coming all the way into the city these days. And even, like I said, now during the pandemic, there are places to see. Canal Side, is an outdoor area that you can come and enjoy the development along the waterfront without actually having to, be put at risk. There's a lot of the Naval Park. There's a lot of outside things still to do. The city, the park, the cemetery. For a while there, when Delaware Park was getting really crowded in the spring, when everybody was sort of tired of being indoors in that first couple of nice days, and there was like hundreds of people walking in Delaware Park because everybody was off, no one was working. And we thought, it's a little too crowded. So we started, my friend and I, walking at Forest Lawn Cemetery. It was just absolutely beautiful. And so I think a lot of people started. So there's lots of places in the city, to come and visit us, even though we can't be indoors, indoor places, but there's certainly some outdoor places that are worth visiting even now.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Thank you. Next thing, how did you come out with the idea of using a psychic to bring different eras into your books? I can't wait to read them. I graduated from UB as an anthropology major. The themes of your books are just so fascinating.
Well, there's kind of a long story there. When I started writing A Whisper of Bones, which is the second book, which takes place in the 1840s, that's when the first sort of inklings of modern spiritualism were starting. And I didn't know that, except that I was reading in, I forget where I was reading, but I was reading an article about the origins of Lilydale. And I started to think, wow, that's really cool. That's something I might want to include in the next book. And I already had this inkling that there were characters that might have what they called the gift of sight. So it was all sort of swimming around in my head. And I was starting to work on The Seer and the Scholar, which was the next book, which primarily to me was, I'm fascinated by the cholera epidemics. I know that's weird, but I am. And so that was what that book was mainly about. But I thought, Lilydale, this is the 1840s. Lilydale's just starting. I'm going to think about that. So I started to think about that. And it was at the point in the book where I needed to decide I was going to go in that direction or not. And I have a blog that and so I was in this online writers group, and this woman had read my blog, and she goes, "Oh, you're from New York? I used to live in the Buffalo area." And I said, "Oh, where?" And she goes, "Oh, Lilydale." And I said, "Really?" And so I started talking, and this was like, honest to God, on the day I was thinking, "Well, I really have to figure out what I'm doing about Lilydale. Do I meet this woman from Lilydale?" So I made arrangements to go down there in June to interview her. And so it was a very weird experience. And I came home and had like a bourbon, because it was that like, whoa, I can't believe what happened kind of stuff. And so I met her and I interviewed her, and it was fascinating. And I realized that this is something that I really was interested in pursuing, because it is an important part of Buffalo's history. Modern spiritualism had, one of its birthplaces was an hour south of here. So that was interesting to me. The dynamic that it played out against the rest of the city was really interesting. So this woman who I was interviewing, Jackie Lunger, who now has become a very good friend of mine, she had actually prepared to spend the whole day with me, which was really kind of her. And so we were having lunch and we ran into one of her other friends. And she told me, you're gonna end up writing about this. This is what you're gonna end up writing. This is the direction your stories are gonna take. So you could argue that I did this because she told me, or you could say that she foresaw it and it happened. I don't know. Either way, it's been a real pleasure to unfold that history, to see how it played out in the city and against the city. And so and this book, In the Shadow of the White Oak, really stretches for me, the boundaries of putting a gifted psychic medium in the story. Like there's this whole sort of rule about, you have to have laws, like what they call laws of magic. So when you're dealing with the supernatural, you have what you establish your laws of magic. The Harry Potter did it, any of those stories, and you have to stay within the boundaries of what you've established as those laws. And so to me, this book really pushed that boundary for me. And so I'm hoping people find it as interesting to read as I did to write it.
Thank you, Roseanne. Next, we have a couple people who wanted us to know that the Buffalo Irish Genealogical Society's website is BIGS, so B as in boy, I, G as in girl, S as in Sam, ny.webs, W-E as in Elvis, B as in boy, S as in Sam.com. So thank you for that.
Definitely worth an inquiry. Donna and Pat made me very welcome. I got my own office to work there. I mean, they really go out of their way to help you. They're incredibly knowledgeable, and a whole lot of fun.
Thank you. Comment. I just did genealogy research for a man in Germany looking to find out what happened to his great-grandfather who left a wife and 4 children for America/Buffalo. They never heard from him again. I found he was admitted to the Buffalo Almshouse as a pauper in 1911. He died there in 1915. Sad story. The man was glad to finally put this story about his great-grandfather, but not as sad as he left his family.
That's fascinating. Did you use, I wonder if this person used the records from the Erie County Poorhouse are now at the Grosvenor Room in the downtown library. So they previously, up until a couple of years ago, weren't accessible, but now they're actually accessible online as well. So it's been a real resource for genealogists who are looking to find relatives that might have been there. I used to get emails all the time before those data were available, because I transcribed those written records into a digital database. But it's a huge, huge resource from the Buffalo Public Library. And so it's exciting, I think, for people to find those portions, those family members, those pieces of their history that they didn't know existed.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Comment. Thank you. Enjoyed hearing some history of Buffalo, especially the postcards. And we have a couple more here, Roseanne. I know we're over time. Would it be okay if we continued with you?
I'm fine with it. I'm more than happy. I don't want to keep people if they're not, if they've got something to do though.
Okay, yeah, people can leave and we are recording, so you can see it later. Next question. Did Buffalo have a place to house and treat tuberculosis patients?
Yes, there were a bunch of different places. The institutions like the Poorhouse and the Buffalo State Asylum each had sort of separate hospital buildings, separate hospital spaces for tuberculosis patients. ECMC, I believe, was established initially to treat tuberculosis patients. There were hospitals, plenty of hospitals. There were sanatoriums that people went to, that weren't in the area, and a lot of these hospitals just weren't available to poor people, partly because of accessibility, partly because they became overcrowded very quickly. It was, and again, partly because people didn't have the luxury of stopping working simply because they were sick. So there were certainly hospitals for tuberculosis. There really wasn't, other than the sort of fresh air and improved diet and rest treatments, those sorts of treatments until antibiotics. Antibiotics really, made the progress towards ending or eliminating tuberculosis. But in prior to the 1940s, excuse me, it was basically a lot of fresh air and a good diet and lots of rest. That was the treatment.
Thank you. So that person who did the genealogy research responded, and they used Ancestry.com and the Grosvenor Room's almshouse records.
Good.
Okay, we have a comment. So fascinating. Tell us more of the plot of the new book.
I don't know that I can. This was a hard lecture to do without giving a lot of it away. For me, like I said, it really stretches the boundaries of my world of psychic mediums as I tell the story. I mean, so the interesting thing about writing fiction is that it does allow you to take liberties in just about everything. However, we like to keep things as close to the truth as possible. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's fun to do these sort of fact behind the fiction lectures, is that you can learn the real story and then see how the story plays out in the book. So Maud really tests her abilities as a psychic medium. She is very confident in her abilities in this book, whereas, prior to these books, she's always been just sort of, and initially was not really willing to accept that this is real. Certainly still asks, why me? Why did I not know the whole time? Why did I get into my 40s before I figured this out, that I had these abilities? And, she's got this mentor, who is based on my friend Jackie Lunger, and Jackie gives me the same sorts of wisdom, which makes me want to try and strangle her. All these things happen for a reason. You have to stay the course. You have to follow the path. You have to trust your intuition. All these things that make me go, I want to know why. So, Maud, I think, that, and I don't have those abilities. I'm not implying that Maud and I are the same person, but Maud definitely has what would have been my reaction had that been happening to me. And in this book, she really decides, all right, well, now that I know I can do this, let's see what I can go find out. And that's what she does. And she ends up seeing these 3 visions, and she has to try to figure out, well, why 3? This is like, I don't understand this. And are they related? And why is this? Of all the things this tree has seen, why are these 3 things being shown to me? And so she does understand that whatever she sees, she's obligated to try to unravel, and it usually has implications in either her life or her orbit, as it were, people around her. So that, I don't know that I can tell you any more without giving it away. I always thought it would be interesting to come back and do this lecture after people have read the book, because then I think it would make a lot more sense.
Like a book club, Rosanne.
Perhaps. I've done a lot of book club talks. I'm happy to do one.
That could be neat. We'll mark it down. The next thing I'm seeing, the ancient Celts who revered the spirits of trees. Is your white oak symbolic also of the enduring wisdom and strength that the Celts believed? Do you see its character symbolic of the strength of the city of Buffalo, or an independent witness of history?
Probably all of the above. I did look into a little bit of the Celtic heritage. Oak trees are, they're symbolic in a lot of different cultures for a lot of the sort of all same reasons. The strength, there's symbols of male energy. So, Maud refers to the tree as grandfather. And I think it is a witness tree. Oak trees are witness trees, and I wish I had Maud's abilities, because I would love to know what the tree has seen. It's such an interesting space. Like I'm sure that the tree on Franklin the sycamore, I'm sure that's seen stuff too. But Delaware Park is just such a part of Buffalo's cultural history. And so for that space, for the tree to have been in that space, which was occupied by a different group of people before Buffalo was anything. It's occupied by the Seneca, who themselves have such a rich cultural history. And so just it being in that spot is really what intrigued me. What had it seen? And I contemplated trying to do some sort of scene that talked about when the park was being built and how because the landscape changed. It was altered to make the park. And I just couldn't get a vision enough in my head because I wanted the tree to react to that its surroundings were changing. And I just couldn't write it. You know, maybe later. It's still on my mind as something I'm interested in. But so yes, definitely a symbol. There's lots of symbolism of the tree.
Great, thank you, Roseanne. Next thing I'm seeing is a comment. You make a good point. We should appreciate buffalo more. And we have some,
Sorry, go ahead.
We have somebody who says, now you can access the Ancestry.com database through the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library website remotely due to COVID-19, so you don't need to be at the library to use it.
Oh, great.
Thank you. And now I'm just seeing a couple thank yous. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your information. I can't wait to read the book. So,
well, thank you all. I really miss Erie County Senior Services. The University Express program is really one of my favorite places to lecture, and the reason for that is the audience always knows so much, and I end up learning a lot, you know, from everybody, and it's having been a university professor, and now I'm actually a grade school teacher, so I've had the opportunity to teach a lot of people. And I love this audience the best because of your willingness to learn and because of what you already know. And every single time I do a lecture for University Express, somebody shares a story or tells me something that I never knew before, and it's always been a wonderful experience. So I really hope there, you know, maybe next year, maybe next fall, we'll be able to meet in person.
I hope so too. Well, stay tuned. Until then, everyone take care. Roseanne, thank you again, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Stay safe.